Hey guys, welcome to your test review for chapters 24 and 25. Make sure that you're doing a good job reading the book. Remember that these reviews are only reviewing the main material for the test. It's not going to cover everything that you need to know for this unit going forward into the AP test and so forth. One thing that I can tell you about this test is this is going to start reaching back into history a little bit. You'll see some things from things like Washington's first farewell address. It'll also reach back and it'll talk a little bit about our lengthy history when it comes to intervention versus isolation. It will go back to a lot to the 1920s because the 1950s was compared a lot to the 1920s, including things like the fear of communism from the 1920s and 1950s. So on the test, make sure you do a good job kind of connecting events from the different time periods. It'll only help you on the writing. So today we're going to cover the years 1945 to 1960, the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower. And you did your little chart and worksheet over Truman's foreign policy and then Eisenhower's foreign policy. And remember when it came to the long telegram and containment. George Kennan is going to write the long telegram, which is going to spell out basically the United States' philosophy of containment. And there were four ways that we were going to contain communism. We were going to ensure collective security and alliances. We were going to provide military aid and participate in the arms race. We were going to provide economic aid to countries that were war torn after World War II, and then we're going to fight in some limited proxy wars. And a lot of these tactics are to stop, obviously, the Soviet Union. And here are two war conferences that the United States, the USSR, and Great Britain all discussed how to split Germany, which is going to lead to some tension going into Truman's presidency. When he becomes president at Potsdam, we could say that he almost uses the revealing of the nuclear weapon as kind of a threat to the Soviet Union. And we talk about body language, and if I want you to look at kind of Roosevelt and Churchill in this picture and how they seem to discuss, they were allies, close allies during World War II. And you can kind of see how Stalin is kind of the third wheel. You can see in his body's position how he's not engaging in conversation like Churchill and Roosevelt, and that's going to kind of really paint a picture going into the Cold War. So, in understanding the Cold War, we understand that the Soviet Union was communist. They don't believe in private property. They were in a police state where the government is going to run the government. The United States practices economic capitalism and democracy. The Cold War was meant for a war of words rather than outright conflict. You'll never see the United States and the Soviet Union ever combat hand to hand in warfare. But like I said, the United States is going to fight in proxy wars. As we work to decolonize a lot of these nations, these are you can almost think of them as like little free agents, and the United States and the Soviet Union are going to vie for influence into these territories. And so, in a lot of these places, the United States may send some military aid to help some of these areas around the world, especially in Southeast Asia. And as we get into the 1960s and the Vietnam War, we'll talk in this review about the Korean War, but also you've got the Vietnam as well, where a lot of our proxy wars are going to take place. All right, so the United Nations is an example of collective security, where we have a General Security Council, where a 15-member body is to authorize peacekeeping and promote international security. Now, if you remember, after World War I, we tried to do this with the League of Nations. You remember the United States is not going to join the League of Nations. If you remember that the Republican Party is going to reject it. And if we were to go all the way back to Washington's farewell address, and we were going to talk about neutrality. And if you remember in Washington's farewell address, this was in response to the French Revolution and whether or not to get involved. And if you remember, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, wanted to get involved in the French Revolution because they helped us during our American Revolution. And Washington kind of shuts the door on that. And as he's leaving office, he says, "Don't get involved in foreign alliances, and don't break off into political parties." And World War I is going to be the first time that we're actually going to join alliances. In the 1920s and 30s, we're isolationists, mainly because of the Great Depression. But when Pearl Harbor hits, we become interventionists. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, during his quarantine speech, he kind of argues against actually expanding the role of the United States. That he only wanted to deal with non-aggressive nations. So if you remember the cash and carry policy, where we only sold weapons to countries that were not aggressive. But we know that after World War II, we'll become a lot of the quarantine speech and his reason for cash and carry was to kind of appease the American people who did not want to get involved in World War II. However, Pearl Harbor is going to change that. And after Pearl Harbor, the United Nations is the continuity of that. And so you got to keep that in mind as you reflect back on our journey through interventionism, isolationism, and then back to interventionism. Winston Churchill is going to not win re-election as prime minister in Great Britain, as all great leaders do. They'll go on little speaking tours in the United States, and in Missouri, he gives a speech and refers to those Eastern European countries as the Iron Curtain, as the Soviets have strongly been aggressive in occupying these nations and turning them communist. Czechoslovakia is one, Poland is another one, as well as Eastern Germany. So when Harry Truman becomes president, a lot of the stuff that you're looking at here is kind of things that happened while he was domestically, while he was president of the United States. A lot of your research for homework was about these things down here: the policy of containment, which was created by George Kennan, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, and then of course the Korean conflict. For Harry Truman, his policy and containment, you did work on the Truman Doctrine, which was provided military aid to places like Turkey and Greece. So I would say, Truman started with a T, Turkey starts with a T, and if you cook a turkey, it creates grease. So that's one way to remember what the Truman Doctrine was: provided military aid so those countries wouldn't fall into communist hands. We create the Department of Defense through the National Security Act, and then we're going to start justifying our defense spending and arms buildup through NSC 68. And this is going to establish alliances with some of those non-communist nations, which we're going to call NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All right, so talking about the defense budget for a minute, as one thing that you need to know as far as when we go into spending, all right, there are two things going on. We're having to fight communism, but at the same time, because of the Great Depression, we're having to spend money also to aid U.S. citizens. And this goes back to the Great Depression when we needed those federal programs. Well, those federal programs are still going to exist, and they need to be given. And so money is going to be allocated to there, as well as fighting communism. Now, one thing you need to remember is that we're going to fight these proxy wars in Korea, which is going to cost money, and in Vietnam as well, which is also going to cost money. And so you can see how much our spending, at least for the defense, is. And when you look at the chart on the test, it'll also bring in some domestic spending as well. You can see that the United States is spending 48% of the world's military spending. And so a lot of times when it comes to fighting with other countries, a lot of them are going to look to the United States, which is one of the reasons why we're considered a superpower, because we do the brunt of the fighting around the world to maintain peace. After World War II, we're going to occupy Japan in hopes of creating an ally in the Pacific to offset China and the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan is an economic aid organization that aims to it's a European recovery program that provides $13 billion in grants and hope to rebuild and develop European infrastructure. Why? To bring those countries to the U.S. side over Great Britain's side. The Soviet Union is going to respond by blocking the railroads leading into Berlin, and so the United States is going to respond through the Berlin Airlift by sending planes over West Berlin and dropping goods. And we'll do this from 1948 to 1949, where over 200,000 flights and 47 tons are dropped over West Berlin, so they do not fall to communism. And here you'll see Germany officially split into East Germany and West Germany. I've already talked about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The Soviet Union will respond with the Warsaw Pact. So this goes with collective security and creating alliances. All right. So one of the conflicts that you see here is the Korean conflict, where North Korea is going to be divided at the 38th parallel with South Korea. but North Korea is going to decide to invade South Korea in hopes of doing that. So the United States, led by Douglas MacArthur, is going to send troops into North Korea, and you can see as the time dwindles on. I'm kind of watching the map here as it goes, but the United States is going to push north up towards the Yalu River, and so what happens is MacArthur wants to launch a formal invasion of China, and so. You can see that we're going to push north and we get up towards the Yalu River. And when MacArthur decides that he wants to get involved with China, that brings China into the war. The Truman will rebuke him. MacArthur will say something negatively about Truman in the press, and he is censored and sent back to the United States. He's still regarded a war hero, but a big mistake by bringing the Chinese into the Korean War. All right. Another way is we're going to continue to create nuclear weapons through nuclear weapon development. In 1949, the Soviet Union is going to detonate their first nuclear weapon. And you can see the other countries are going to detonate theirs as well. All right. The other day, we talked about the election of 1948 and how the Dixiecrats, because Truman is going to integrate the military, the Dixiecrats are going to leave the Democratic Party. So we thought that the Republicans under George Dewey was going to win the election of 1948. However, California and other Western states are going to vote in favor of Truman, so Truman wins the election in 1948. And there you see the iconic picture of Dewey defeats Truman. This is Truman's Fair Deal program, which is an extension of the New Deal program. You won't need to know for a test, but if you're ever in an essay question about the continuity of the Great Depression, here is Truman's Fair Deal. We'll really get into it with the Great Society under Lyndon B. Johnson. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower will become the President of the United States. He's a Republican, hero of World War II, so he'll kind of use that. He'll use that to his advantage to be elected president. And under Eisenhower, he uses a thing called the military-industrial complex, where he is willing to use nuclear weapons to maintain law and order against the Soviet Union over sending our men to fight. He's going to create the interstate. He's going to sign off on the interstate highway system, which our interstates are going to be created to do two things: evacuate major cities in case there's a bomb threat, and also move nuclear weapons from one place to another using wide lanes and those high overpasses. You see, they weren't built just for 18-wheelers. All right, they were built to move weapons. So here's your interstate highway system, and there we are right here in Houston, crossing I-10 and I-45. All right, so talking about the second Red Scare, if you remember during the 1920s, there was a fear of radicals entering the workforce through immigrants. And so if you remember the 1920s, we're going to pass many immigration laws that are going to lead to stricter ways of getting in. Remember the quota laws, because many people did not want, there are a lot of anxieties of any type of Soviet influence, at least in the working class. Well, when we get to the 1950s, McCarthy is going to, Joe McCarthy is going to lead a movement called McCarthyism, where he believes that there are communists within the U.S. government. So these anxieties of the Soviet influence is going to take shape only now it's in the government. It's going to force people to take loyalty oaths if they're investigated by the House of Un-American Activities Committee, led by Richard Nixon. But McCarthy is going to go after the U.S. Army on TV, and he kind of looks bad doing that, and so he begins. He gets censored as a result. And that's kind of the end of Joseph McCarthy. But it does show the fear of communism entering the United States. All right, so other things on the second Red Scare. We already talked about the Army McCarthy earrings that looked bad on national TV. In 1956, Eisenhower will be reelected. You can see overwhelmingly. And we've already talked about brinkmanship and massive retaliation, which is basically the ability to get to the verge without getting into the war is the necessary art. Let's see here. Domino theory we'll get into when we get to Southeast Asia, but the domino theory is the belief that if one country falls to communism, the next one is going to do it. So Zedong is going to take over in China, which leads to North Korea becoming communist, North Vietnam becoming communist, and now all these countries in Southeast Asia are next. But we're gonna fight and stop it in Korea. We'll try to fight it in Vietnam, and we'll be unsuccessful in doing that. And several of these countries are going to fall to communism during the 60s and 70s. Let's see. One thing we never mentioned in class was the space race, and we'll get more into that. Is one of Kennedy's visions to put a man on the moon. Well, the Soviet Union is going to win the technological war by putting the first satellite into space, and it was called Sputnik. And what Sputnik does is it creates more of an effort for the United States in the schools to maintain like science and more science classes and more math classes to take, so we can be more advanced. And we end up culminating by winning, putting the first man on the moon and winning the space race. When Gary Powers gets shot down in the U-2 spy plane incident, this is where Khrushchev will decide to build the Berlin Wall. And I know I'm jumping a lot of things. All right, so there's the military-industrial complex where we talked about the possibility of using nukes instead of men to fight the war. We can kind of you can kind of stop and pause and look at the aspects of the military industrial complex. I know some of the classes we went over this in class. All right, so going into the baby boom and kind of switching gears and going into the 1950s, you can see that there's an increase in birth rate after the 1950s, and this is going to cause an economic boom in the United States because of the baby boom. A lot of different industries are going to come about. There's going to be a need for more pediatricians to for these kids. You're going to build more toys. You're going to build more schools, which means you're going to hire more teachers. So think of anything that a kid or a baby needs in order to survive. Baby bottles, cribs. All those are little industries that are going to create jobs and are going to create an economic boom in the United States. It's going to expand the middle class to include more people, and it's going to be a rise in prosperity. And this is very similar to what happened in the 1920s with our economic boom. Many people are going to start moving to the Sun Belt, which is the area that's going to cover from California to Florida. So people are going to start making their way south, especially with the invention of air conditioning. Unfortunately, there are still pockets of poverty in inner cities, which is going to lead to a lot of problems. That is going to be try to be combated through the Great Society program and the extension of the New Deal programs. But poverty is still going to exist. Remember, it's one of those things that's going to be a continuity in our era. Many people are going to move to the suburbs. So you see this little picture of Levittown, these postcards of Levittown that's going to be on your test tomorrow. Remember that Levittown is basically the building of these cookie cutter similar homes, suburbs outside of major cities. Many middle class white Americans are going to move out to Levittown, where they're basically it's a form of social conformity. As these kids that grow up, they're going to be the first generation of kids who grow up with basically being able to have wants rather than needs, and the beatnik generation is going to be born. And so the beatniks are going to reject kind of this Levittown lifestyle, showing that there's more to life than just conforming to these white subdivisions. Because of this white flight, where people are going to leave inner cities, this is kind of an example of de facto segregation, where it's segregation by tradition. It was not illegal for African Americans to move to the suburbs, but it was more likely that that whites were going to move to the suburbs and blacks were going to stay in the inner cities, which are going to lead to urban decay because there's economic inequality that's going on in America, where whites are going to make a little bit more money and have the ability to move out. So yeah, all right. So in the 50s, you have living the American dream. People are going to start buying television sets, which is their main form of entertainment. Women, if you remember, women during the 1940s are going to contribute to the mobilization on the home front, which gives many opportunities for women. But in the 1950s, as the men come home, they begin moving to the suburbs, and they almost regress in the idea of their equal rights. Many of them are going to serve as housewives, raise the children, kind of the cult of domesticity that we've talked about in the past, but they still have economic opportunity, which is going to be revived in the 1960s. All right, here's more stuff on the women. Middle class growth is going to lead to a reinforced cult of domesticity. If you get a chance, read this little guide on the Good Wife. Very, very sexist, and definitely something that most women in today's era would reject and say there ain't no way that I'm following these set of rules. So yeah. some other things you need to know. Just, we talked a lot about, like, if you look on the bottom, like I Love Lucy, they were a married couple, but they slept in separate beds because it was taboo to show that on television. There was a return to social values. Billy Graham, who died recently, was a evangelical preacher who preached on good moral values to be pure, but also not well preaching the gospel of Christ. So you can see the church membership is going to grow between the 1950s and 1960s, and a lot of it is because of the threat of nuclear war, that they could have been obliterated off the face of the earth at any time. So a lot of them turned to God for help. For the teenagers, we talked about the Beatnik movement and the rebellion. They're a quiet generation. They are attracted to the lifestyle of rock and roll, television, and movie stars. There's a rise in juvenile delinquency, and we've already talked about the rejection of contemporary conformists through the Beat generation. Now, this is going to lead to a movement known as SDS, and I think I've got a slide later on in the presentation that talks about SDS. But basically, this is a group of college students that get together. They're disillusioned with domestic values, Cold War events. They claim that the radicals are not doing enough to address any racial, social, and economic inequality, or I'm sorry, to address social and economic equality. And this is basically, teenagers, the beatniks, the SDS, they're all going to reject basically the parents' generation. And this is something that happens over and over again. And I'm sure that your parents, when they yell at you about stuff, you don't think that they understand what you're going through. And the same thing with the grandparents. Your grandparents thought the same thing your parents. And guess what, guys? You're going to think the same way about your kids as well. Here are some examples of television in the 1950s. You're not going to see a whole lot of this on the test, but this is just mainly talking about the lifestyle film in the 1950s. Charleston Heston and the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, and some westerns and Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean here on the left, who died at an early age. Would have been one of our more famous TV stars during the 50s and 60s. We talked about Elvis Presley and the rise of rock and roll, along with Chuck Berry, Frank Sinatra, Billie Holiday, and classic pop. And then there's literature, and On the Road by Jack Kerouac is known as kind of being the anthem for the hippies in the 1960s. All right, so getting into civil rights. All right, you need to we talked about the civil rights movement the other day, but you need to understand that there was a series of legislative and legal events that happened in post-war Reconstruction. You can see the 13th and 15th Amendment, and then you can see some setbacks in the 1920s, but in the 1950s, Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968 were all legal and legislative victories done by the Civil Rights Movement. It's going to inspire other movements like the Native Americans, who are going to fight for their land that they had lost in San Francisco and in Montana, which we'll talk about after this test. But overall, their obstacles was to achieve economic equality, but the problem is that a lot of them had different strategies and goals, and we've talked about them. Civil rights movement in 1954 is going to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, which led to the Little Rock Nine, where Eisenhower uses the army to enforce law. Montgomery Gospel Boycott, led by Rosa Parks, where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin Luther King come to her aid. And you know that Martin Luther King is kind of the poster boy for the civil rights movement. Things you need to remember about Martin Luther King: he wanted equal rights. He wanted radical integration. He was for civil disobedience. You know that he used that nonviolent methods. He believed that we were part of a global and social change. All right, and so this is going to be a little bit more conservative than, say, Malcolm X. Here are some of the tragedies that occur for civil rights. We've talked about extensively about Emmett Till. Medgar Evers was a civil rights activist that was murdered in 1963. And here in a minute, we're going to come upon Malcolm X. And you need to know a little bit about Malcolm X. We've covered a lot of this in class, so if you need to go back over these little tactics and these little events like the I Have a Dream speech. Civil Rights Act of 64, I told you, was a legislative victory. Selma March in 1965. The elimination of poll taxes through the 24th Amendment in 1964. All right, so for Malcolm X, make sure and we'll talk about Malcolm X in class on Wednesday. But Malcolm X he promoted black separatism. He also believed that civil rights was part of a global and social change. He believed he was more familiar with the radical leftists. The radical leftists identified with Malcolm X, and he didn't believe. He believed that you need be a little bit more active than, say, civil disobedience to achieve equal rights. He says here, we don't teach you turn the other cheek. We teach you to obey the law, but at the same time, we teach you that if anyone puts his hands on you, you do your best to see that he doesn't put it on anybody else. All right. Which will lead to Black Power and the Black Panther Party. Urban riots are going to occur in the 1960s. And then, of course, the Kerner Commission, which he creates, Lyndon B. Johnson creates a commission to investigate the urban riots. And this is where we talk about economic inequality in urban cities and that the government has done little to help. There's police violence, there's housing discrimination, job discrimination, and unfortunately for Lyndon B. Johnson, he doesn't really do anything with the report. Of course, you're going to find out with Vietnam, he was dragged around because of the Vietnam War. All right, and then here's the SDS that you'll need to know for your test. It's kind of that one random thing that's kind of on the test, and you're trying to figure out how it fits on the test. But remember, like I said, that they were disillusioned with the domestic values of living in Levittown. They were disillusioned with the Cold War events going on around the world, and there were nothing to do. Radicals were doing very little, and they're basically going to reject their parents' generation, and I think that is it. So make sure that you do a good job studying for the test. Use this review as kind of a starting point, but don't be afraid to dig a little deeper. All right. So best of luck to you. If you have any questions, come talk to me. Let's see. Gotta find out how to turn this thing off. There it is.